We start a new chapter, chapter 41, and the reading is from verses 1 to 7. But because I mentioned it in my commentary, I won't bother to reading them all. Let's just start. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, 2 full years, that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. You see, after the prisoners were released, that's at the end of Genesis 40, 2 full years had passed. In the Hebrew, it says 2 full year cycles had passed. Folks, that would mean that it was Pharaoh's birthday again. So Pharaoh, 2 years ago, had released the prisoners, had a great feast for all his servants. Now 2 full year cycles had passed. Guess what that means? It's his birthday coming up. This is how it was worded in verse 1. We read it. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. So on the eve of his birthday, he dreamed, and in his dream he stood by the river, which is Egypt, would only mean the Nile River, the river. Anywhere else outside of Egypt would be the Euphrates River. But in Egypt, that's the Nile River. So the dream goes on. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed. That's another way of saying out of the river arose 7 sleek, fat, and plump cows or cattle. And in the dream they came out of the river. So to the Egyptians, the Nile symbolized fertility and life and plenty. Then suddenly, in this dream, behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored, lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. Wow. Now the 7 other cattle, which also arose out of that river, right, were ugly. Ill-favored means ugly, and very thin, and with their bones sticking out, and having scarcely any flesh upon them. What is rendered in the Authorized Version as ill-favored, again, I said that, means that these creatures were quite ugly to look at. But the dream doesn't end there. It becomes a nightmare. Those ill-favored and lean-fleshed cows ate up those 7 well-favored and fat cows. What a disturbing and terrifying sight. My goodness, the ugly and very thin cows grabbed and devoured the fat and plump cows. Whoa. What was particularly disturbing about this is that normally cows are very docile and lame. Suddenly rising up and starting to eat, oh my goodness. So disturbing was the scene that Pharaoh awoke. He awoke, and it was a nightmare. So he settled down to sleep again. And he slept and dreamt a second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk. It says rank and good. To North Americans, this would be pictured as the corn on the cob variety, right? Corn. But corn here simply means grain. 7 ears of grain on one stalk would also have been an unusual sight. Could you imagine rye or wheat ear? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Growing on one stalk? I couldn't picture it. That would be nuts. But that also represented being fruitful beyond imagination. Next, behold. This is the wording here. Behold, 7 thin ears and blasted with the east wind sprang up after them. The east wind had always been fatal to grains in Egypt, being very dry, often sand-filled, blowing across the desert and blasting and withering the grain. Blasted by the east wind was a description of the withered appearance of the very thin ears of grain. And the 7 thin ears, guess what they did? Like a Venus flytrap, they devoured the full grains, the full ears of grain. These 7 ears of grain, which presumably came from individual stalks, devoured the 7 fruitful and full ears of grain in his dream. This dream also must have been extremely vivid and disturbing, that Pharaoh woke up again, and behold, whew, wow, it was a dream. Both these dreams were so unusual that they could not vanish from his mind. In fact, they disturbed him. You know, this made him desirous to seek some sort of interpretation, to see what this was all about. Pharaoh was so desperate that he sought someone wise to interpret his dreams. Now, as we shall see next, in verse 14, it would be Joseph who was called. Well, maybe not the next, but the one after that. Do you realize that devoted believers in the one true God, in other words, authentic Christians, ought to be the wisest people on the face of the earth? Now, Joseph was a believer in the one true God, wasn't he? And he was definitely wise. But folks, do you realize that Christians ought to be the wisest people on the face of this earth? I remember my daughter being picked on for being a Christian in her high school. She always stood up for righteousness, and they all picked on her. But when they were in trouble, guess who they went to? My daughter. Guess where they sought their wisdom? Again, my daughter. But sadly, in the 21st century, being wise is considered rare. And you know, for this, many people who call themselves Christians, all I can say is, shame on you.